So I'm going to talk about the 1992 consensus and ask the question of whether it's a harmless mantra, a dangerous trap, how it played a role in the election, not just in terms of the campaign and who people were deciding to support, to vote for, and so on, but also what the implications are now of Ma Ying-jeou's embracing of the 1992 consensus for cross-strait relations and even down the road for U.S.-China relations. By the way, there's a map of the Republic of China, official map of the Republic of China. We'll have a chance to revisit this map. It's a pretty big version of alternative China, isn't it? So we'll talk about that again in a minute. And you saw that Clay earlier had a poster from the 1950s, 我们一定要解放 Taiwan. We certainly will liberate Taiwan. This photo here is in Beijing, taken in December 2004. And these are obviously some PLA officers nearby. So that poster and that sentiment is still alive and well, important to understand and think about when we talk about Taiwan's election, especially the consensus. So others have already made the point, Stan in particular, that even though a lot of people have said over and over again, including when we were there last week, these elections aren't about cross-strait relations or foreign policy or anything. They're about social and economic issues. But those people were wrong, I think, because socioeconomic issues are inseparable these days from cross-strait issues. Everybody knows this because of the tight economic relationship in particular. A voter doesn't have to know the wonkish details of the 1992 consensus to realize that in the first place, rejecting it could mean serious economic damage for Taiwan, and in particular for real Taiwan people in real Taiwan families, because so many are dependent now on a healthy economic relationship with China. Also, that B, though, accepting the 1992 consensus could mean downgrading Taiwan's international status almost immediately, and then in the longer term, slowly encouraging people to think it's going to become another Hong Kong or Macau, another special administrative region of China. So this is a very serious issue. Very serious issue that voters in Taiwan have to think about. In the end, most ended up supporting the candidate who acknowledged the consensus. So what is it then, the consensus? Why do most voters accept it? We don't know how enthusiastically, but at least they reluctantly accept it. What are the implications for cross-strait relations in the years ahead? Well, it was in 1992, the KMT and CCP, both then still ruling KMT as an authoritarian party, informally agreed to what would later be termed the 1992 consensus. It's complicated on exactly what they agreed to then, and whether it was called a consensus then. We won't get into that. The main points you're probably familiar with. The two sides agreed that there is only one China in the world, but each side can express different interpretations of what one China means. Beijing can thus claim that the one China in the world is the PRC, right? Taipei can thus claim that the one China in the world is the ROC, and this is taken very seriously. Ma Ying-jeou said in his press conference that we went to last week, our one China is the Republic of China, of course. With this kind of big map, with territorial disputes with Mongolia, Myanmar, Burma, India, a whole bunch of territorial disputes. So there's a kind of a fictitious element to it that people in the KMT will privately, of course, acknowledge. Not publicly, they can't do it, but privately will acknowledge. Both KMT and the CCP agreed that Taiwan is an inalienable part of the world's one China. And to Beijing then, if the Taiwan side is willing to accept this formulation, the so-called consensus, the two sides of the strait can proceed with amicable relations on the road to eventual inevitable unification. That's Beijing's interpretation of the function of the 92 consensus. Taiwan's perception and understanding is different, as we know, because Ma Ying-jeou thinks apparently that he can sign a peace treaty with China, freezing the status quo. I think it's clear just from looking at the record of statements in China, what intellectuals say, leaders and so on, and forced posturing and all of that, that China's ultimate objective is inevitable unification. And that's what the 1992 consensus is designed to pave the way for. Now, it didn't take long in Taiwan for people to become disillusioned with the 1992 consensus concept, even in its early amorphous stage. Because in August 1993, the PRC issued a white paper on Taiwan, kind of a policy statement. And two key sections in particular discredited the consensus for many people in Taiwan. And this is quoting now from this PRC white paper. There is only one China in the world. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and the seat of China's central government is Beijing. So the first two parts of that sentence are in the 92 consensus. The third part is to specify that there's a center to this one China in the world, and its government is in Beijing. So it's clearly saying, it's clearly muddying this concept of there really actually being two Chinas, or each side can have a different explanation. And then they go on, this is universally recognized, and the Chinese government opposes various alternatives to one country, two systems, which is the plan that Hong Kong was in the process of being absorbed into China during that time, 1997, and Macau as well. And secondly, second section, and this is again a quotation, after reunification, Taiwan will become a PRC special administrative region. Said straightforwardly, although it will be distinguished from the other provinces or regions of China by a higher degree of autonomy in a variety of ways, and even allowed to keep a military force of some sort. But clearly stating, you know, even though we had this consensus the year before, here's the ultimate outcome, we're telling you what it's going to be. That's when Li Denghui in particular was starting to get very worried about China. That's why he conceived the ambition to go to Cornell in 1995, and then you know what happens in the late 1990s. A lot of it is because of what happened to the consensus very early on. So by the time Chen Shui-bian becomes president, he rejects the consensus and the related one China principle. He says, I'm willing to talk with China about the one China principle and this consensus idea, but I'm not willing to accept it as a precondition for talks. China said, you must accept it as a precondition or we won't talk with you. Chen never did, and China never spoke with Chen during those 8 years, those 8 rocky years. Here quickly is how he explained his reasoning. These are again quotations. He said there was no consensus. And he points also to the 1993 white paper. Never has anyone on the China side indicated that one China can actually have dual interpretations. We know what the one China is. So accepting that so-called consensus would be tantamount to forsaking Taiwan's national sovereignty and arguing that our democratic Taiwan is a part of the authoritarian PRC. In the international community, he continued, the reality is, whether it's in the United Nations or everywhere or elsewhere, everyone knows what one China is. It's the PRC. And there's no room for dual interpretation. So this notion of each side can have its own interpretation is silly, was silly to Chen Shui-bian. And of course, that's still ultimately the DPP position today. Now, Ying-jeou accepted the consensus. I'm not going to have time to go into why, but it's basically because he thinks, you know, you can't know exactly what somebody is thinking, but apparently he thinks this is a safe enough thing to do. It's kind of a mantra we can chant because we need very importantly to improve our economic relations with China and to reduce the tension in the strait. So it's safe enough to go ahead and articulate our acceptance of this, even though he's a smart enough man to know that, you know, the ROC is not the one China. He says it doesn't harm the sovereignty of the ROC at all, and in fact what it does is it paves the way for these important agreements, including Act 515 agreements that he succeeded in signing with the PRC. So to him, it's just a safe mantra you can chant. Tsai Ing-wen took kind of like the Chen Shui-bian position, although with more moderate rhetoric. And she says, for almost all Taiwanese, we like to think we're a sovereign country. If you accept the 1992 consensus, in effect, you're saying to the world that we're not really a sovereign country or won't be forever. And once people outside in other countries start thinking like that, then they start pulling their ambassadors home. They start not selling weapons to Taiwan. Their commitment to Taiwan's defense starts to weaken, and before you know it, it is a special administrative region of China. All right, and here's, you know, kind of the inflamed DPP approach to this. This is actually how they perceive the issue. Ma as a horse, of course, and Hu riding him, an angry-looking horse, but horse getting the job done. Of course, on the other side of the coin, people who supported Ma, the majority, said, but he got things done. We have a burgeoning economic relationship and so on, so it worked for us. Now, under Tsai, the DPP tried to posit two alternative slogans or concepts to conceptualize the cross-strait relationship, to replace the 1992 consensus concept. And they very cleverly appropriated concepts that the PRC had already been using under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao for several years, starting in the early mid-2000s. Like, we can take their words and appropriate them. Maybe they'll appreciate that, and maybe we'll find some ground for negotiating. So the first one was peaceful development. This is a pretty straightforward concept. Under Hu, his brain trust, people started arguing China would never start a war with the United States or any other power. We don't want a war because we need a peaceful environment, at least for the next 20 or so years, to develop the economy. Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP said, that's what we want too. Second one was more interesting. PRC scholars and officials articulated this notion of countries of the world can be interact harmoniously with each other, but still be distinct in terms of their political, social, cultural systems. It's actually an ancient Confucian saying. They updated this he er bu tong, and have been using it, especially in the last few years, very frequently. It's actually a rejoinder to the so-called democratic peace hypothesis, which implies that unless China reforms politically, becomes democratic, there could be a serious problem in the future between the United States and China. There could be violent conflict. China says, no, that's not necessarily the case. So the DPP said, yeah, we can be harmonious with you, China, but also distinct too. We love that idea. But the problem is the CCP clearly intended these slogans to apply to relations between nation states, not across the strait. So, right, because they don't regard Taiwan as another nation state. It's a part of China ultimately. So you can just imagine maybe the DPP people thought, well, this ought to have a lot of appeal in Beijing. Actually, I can imagine the CCP leaders were outraged and furious that Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP would try to do this because it's needling China from their perspective. It's another kind of way of declaring independence. And I don't know how well you can see that chart, but it wasn't going to work very well in Taiwan if there was something that Tsai couldn't come up with to mollify Beijing. It was going to be very hard for her to win this election, I think, just because you can see the second, I don't have a pointer. Is this a pointer?
It is.
The red? Yeah, well, the second column there shows the annual percentage increases in trade between Taiwan on the one hand and China, Hong Kong, and Macau on the other from 1989 2010. You can see it's always increasing very rapidly, except for 2009 when the global financial crisis hit. Over here, I doubt you can see this, but this just shows that in the year after ECFA, Taiwan's trade with China itself increased by 16%. And ECFA is only in its first stage of implementation yet, so seem to be working well. I think Vincent alluded to the fact that a lot of Taiwan commercial leaders endorsed, I don't know why we got hieroglyphics there, that's a newspaper story talking about these leading Taiwan firms who've developed global brands with global appeal. All are heavily invested in China. You can see here how this investment has increased. Look at 2010, the leap after the 2009 decline. ECFA will, actually they're discussing now, the next stage in this whole process is discussing some sort of investment agreement with China. And I won't have time. I just want to conclude by exploring the implications of the fact that in October, Ma dangled the prospect of political negotiations with China in a second term. These might lead, he said, he's actually been saying for a while, to some sort of peace agreement across the strait. DPP called this idea naive and said it could resemble the PRC's agreement with Tibet in the early 1950s. It could be very, very dangerous for Taiwan. Ma's poll ratings temporarily plummeted, so then he backtracked on the proposal and attached a lot of arduous conditions to it. For example, it'd have to be in Taiwan's national interest, you have to have a referendum before we would proceed. But the idea was already out there, and now we face the distinct possibility that Ma has raised Beijing's expectations of what he might be able to deliver to them, to China, in a second term. They may have already thought Ma is going to owe them because of the way they assisted in a variety of ways, just by not intervening, for one thing, with Ma's winning the election. But since he floated this idea, it's possible that China might raise the pressure on Ma to agree to some sort of political roadmap to unification, something like a one country, two systems status. So let's just put, to conclude then here, on the one hand, why China might not now pressure Ma on political talks. And on the other hand, why, in fact, it might very well decide to step up the pressure. We'll put four of each on the table, and then you can tell us, we can talk about which you think is right. Why might it not now pressure Ma? Well, for one thing, CCP leaders are patient. They might just want to first wait some more for Taiwan to become even more economically dependent on China. ECFA, again, is only in the early harvest implementation stage. There's a lot more to go. So why not just wait, let things continue to develop, let more people in Taiwan, the fishing villages in the south, the growers of the fruit being sold to China, let more and more people realize they need to be nice to China because it benefits them economically. Why not wait? On the other hand, though, military leaders and other hawks who've been increasingly outspoken in recent years are less patient. They might think the current U.S. military and economic weakness, along with our political disarray, make now the right time to start coercing Taiwan more aggressively. If you look at PLA writings on this, it's clear they're not going to wait forever. And after all, the State Council, it was, I think, in February 2000, issued a white paper saying we're not going to wait forever for Taiwan to agree to some sort of solution. Second, for why it now might not be the time, CCP leaders may confidently think that China's rise will continue inevitably, and that'll have an effect on Taiwan identity. The Taiwanese people will become filled with a kind of national Chinese pride and will want to jump on the bandwagon. I've actually read a lot of PRC writers who think because Taiwanese are essentially Chinese, it's just a matter of eventually recognizing, discovering that Chineseness in themselves, and one thing that could trigger that is identification with China's increasing greatness. So people in China may think, therefore, let's just continue to wait. On the other hand, the Central Party leadership understands that China's economy suffers from serious weaknesses, and there's terrible inequalities, and you know all about that. It would be better, some people might think, to press a deal on Taiwan now, just in case China's rise falters in the near future. A lot of economists are writing in China now, worried that China might get stuck at a middle income level. They call it the Latin America trap. And if that kind of thing happens, then maybe Taiwanese will start to feel less in awe of China and less worried. Third, on why now might not be the time, leaders can see for themselves that Taiwan opinion is divided. It's a very close election in many ways. So pushing too hard, too fast on Ma in a second term could backfire. Because if there's going to be another election in 2016, unless they think they can solve it fast, which I don't think anybody really does think, if they push Ma too hard, the KMT could lose the elections in 2016. The DPP could be back. Clearly, the CCP doesn't want that to happen, so they might prefer caution. Still, though, there's an argument that it could step up pressure because Taiwan identity is far from fading. Indeed, it's probably strengthening. DPP did very well this time. It could improve in 2016. After all, the KMT candidate will not be an incumbent at that time. Best not to let these ominous forces, these green forces, consolidate their power, some in China might conclude, depending on how they see the trends. And then last, the new group of Chinese leaders may be even weaker and less visionary than Hu Jintao. None may want to stick their necks out on such a sensitive, complex issue. I mean, it's more and more collective leadership. Under Hu, certainly it was that way. Maybe no one's going to want to take a chance on something this big, and they'll just sort of pass the buck and not do anything and look forward to their 10 years being over and hope somebody else solves the problem down the road. Yet precisely because the new CCP leaders could be weak, they may want to prove their patriotic bona fides by, quote, reunifying the country. Easier to do that now with Ma, perhaps, than to take a chance with some green successor. Okay, I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have some time for conversation.